Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Sports as a Weapon podcast, a Chicano sports podcast on the entanglement of sports, radical politics, and working class sports fan culture. And don't worry, we talk about just sports too. Sports as a Weapon is part of the ANTICONQUISTA Media Collective. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. We are dedicated to exposing and fighting the capitalist imperialist system, the root cause of our displacement. As always, subscribe to the ANTICONQUISTA Patreon at patreon.com/ANTICONQUISTA and follow ANTICONQUISTA on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, X, and Instagram. And also, be sure to listen, subscribe to our podcast, the Sports as a Weapon podcast, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, now that we're doing video, the video of the podcast episode goes on the ANTICONQUISTA YouTube, and you can follow the Sports as a Weapon podcast at Sports as a Weapon podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Sports as a Weapon on Twitter, X, and YouTube, and I believe now I'm on Unscrolled. I believe that's the name of the new app that came out that's Palestinian owned. So another new episode. I'm very excited to get into this episode. I haven't really covered this topic before, maybe I think only once, and then talked about it as part of other like a subtopics before, but we're going to talk about the WNBA today. And my guest is a journalist that covers the WNBA. His name is Zachary Draves. He's been the beat writer for the Chicago Sky and Iowa Hawkeyes, and I believe now the Bulls as well. He could tell you about it. At Swish Appeal since 2021. He is a sports writer, high school broadcaster, and he's also an educator and an inspiring filmmaker. He writes mostly at Sports Nation, at Swish Appeal, and I think at Clutch Points as well. He has written at Sports Illustrated, as well as The Source, and other places. So very, very excited to welcome Zach to the podcast, or Zachary, I don't know what you like to go by. But we're excited to talk about the WNBA. We're going to cover a few things about the WNBA. Thank you for coming to the podcast, Zachary.
Great to be here, Miguel. Great to be here.
Yeah, if you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I hold many different titles. So as you mentioned, I'm currently the beat writer, or have been the beat writer for the Chicago Sky and for Iowa women's basketball since 2021 for SB Nation Swish Appeal. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to cover the likes of Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese and so many great players, and been there for some great moments for each of them. I've covered WNBA All-Star games, including the one last summer in Indianapolis, which was a great experience, and then also been able to do some feature interviews with some high-profile players and legends of the game who have come down the pike, and also doing opinion pieces that relate to the intersection of women's basketball in the context of, politics, social issues, and all that good stuff.
Great. And I know today we're going to talk about some of your work you've done recently within the past month. Article that just came out a couple of days ago talking about the WNBA and the passing of Jesse Jackson. And then you also covered the response by a lot of WNBA players who are playing in their other off-season leagues right now, and their response to the ICE killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. So we're going to get into that. And then I also want to cover the CBA negotiations. And I know you have some history of the WNBA, as you said, you're very knowledgeable, and we're going to get into that as well. So now let's get into it. My first question has to do with your article regarding ICE and the WNBA response. Can you tell me give the audience, I know some of them they probably know about this, a lot of our audience, But explain what happened and why the WNBA, what the players' response after the ICE killings in Minnesota.
Yeah, so by now we all know about the two notable killings by ICE in Minneapolis, Minnesota, of Alex Preddy and of Renee Good, that has really shined a light on sort of the aggressive tactics of ICE in this particular time in the context of the Trump administration and their very draconian crackdown on immigration and sort of the militarizing of ICE that has evoked real genuine feelings of terror and uncertainty in places like Minneapolis, Minnesota. And what was interesting about the response that came out of that, particularly from players in the WNBA and just athletes in general, is because I'm sure, as you remember, and I'm sure your listeners remember, back in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, ironically, during COVID, when everybody was locked down, you saw this enormous response from pretty much everybody, but especially from athletes to the in ways that we hadn't seen in decades. I would contend probably since the 1960s. I mean, we had seen athletes speak out from time to time on occasion, but never as a collective in this magnitude. I mean, you saw athletes hit the streets. You saw athletes, really call to attention about issues surrounding police violence and systemic racism. In the case of the WNBA, they were confined into the bubble in Orlando for the duration of their COVID shortened season in August of 2020. Or as they referred to it as the wubble, and the bubble was referred to the NBA players that were there in Orlando, and then the wubble was referred to the WNBA players. And the WNBA really took it upon themselves to shed a light on issues around systemic racism. As you remember, George Floyd came after the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. And so the players in the W really shined a light on particularly Black women and other women of color that were killed by police, and saying their names collectively. They banded together in one of the most, strategic, effective moments of civic engagement that we'll ever see. I mean, they helped change the course of political history because they're the ones who got Raphael Warnock, who's now currently the senator from Georgia, to the Senate seat, in defeating Kelly Loeffler, who was then the co-owner of the Atlanta Dream. After she made some disparaging marks about Black Lives Matter, the players banded together and they formed a collective unit to pretty much carry Raphael Warnock to the finish line, and that's what happened. So you had this outspokenness among athletes at that time because it was front and center, and you had all these different things that were happening all around the same time. And then you fast forward to 2025, and then athletes are largely mute. As the second Trump administration comes into effect, you started seeing a lot more athletes, saying virtually nothing on issues around politics. But then come this past January, and you see the killings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good, and then all of a sudden, athletes decided that this was their time to speak up and break that silence. And it really wasn't that surprising to see players in the WNBA speak up. So right now, the players in the WNBA, or many of them, are playing in the alternative 3-on-3 professional league Unrivaled, which is in its second season in Miami right now. And one of the players to speak up was Breanna Stewart, who is of the New York Liberty. She's an all-star Olympian. And during player introduction, she came out carrying a sign that said "Abolish ICE." And it was not only a bold political statement on her part, but it was also very personal. It was also very personal for her because her wife is an immigrant. So this is something that resonated with her. And then from there, you started seeing more and more players speak up on social media in press conference settings. Paige Bueckers, coming off her Rookie of the Year season with the Dallas Wings, spoke up and called out ICE. You started seeing other players like Breonna Taylor, who's a ubiquitous veteran player, speak out. You saw Angel Reese, as I mentioned before, of the Chicago Sky, very high-profile player. She spoke up on social media, and many other players followed suit. And it really wasn't surprising because the WNBA has always been at the forefront of speaking up on social and political issues, as I articulated in that article, which dates all the way back to 2016. So if you remember, and if your listeners remember, back in 2016, you had all these things happening all at one time in July of 2016. So you had the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, you had 5 police officers that were killed in Dallas, Texas, and it all happened at one time. So the WNBA season was in full swing. And interestingly enough, we find ourselves once again in Minneapolis, where the Minnesota Lynx, led by the great Maya Moore, sort of put out that call to action for athletes to speak up on these pressing matters of race and injustice and so forth. And they wore these iconic T-shirts that says "Change starts with us." And that was 1 month before Colin Kaepernick took a knee, the backup quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, who now is very famous for taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem in protest of racial injustice and police brutality. Eventually was ousted by the NFL, and that unleashed a whole new conversation about athlete activism, or a new era of athlete activism. And while it's natural to want to give credit to Colin Kaepernick, let's also remember that it was the players in the WNBA who came before him, 1 month to be exact, before he took a knee. And so to see players in the WNBA speak out on pressing and current political and social issues is nothing that's unheard of.
All right, thanks, Zach. That was a great response to my question, and especially pointing out that history of Maya Moore in Minnesota, in 2016, playing for the Minnesota WNBA team, doing that before Kaepernick, a month before. But like you said, the history kind of and then usually that's what happens. They always do that. They always somehow give the man a credit before a woman, historically, and still happens. Not that they did it on purpose, not that Kaepernick did anything, but they really highlighted Kaepernick, obviously. Plus, it's the NFL, so it gets more publicity. But it's great to point out, because I remember that happening, but I also forgot because of Kaepernick. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. She did do that before, and she also stopped playing as well, because I know once she got married, she decided to focus on social justice issues, which I think you touched in the article. But also I wanted to touch on, you talking about the current players. You gave that history of 2020, George Floyd, and back then with Miss Moore in 2016. But now with these current players speaking up with Abolish ICE, speaking up against ICE, I thought it was very cool to see Paige Bueckers talk about it, because she's from Minnesota. You point that out in the article. Just seeing someone like her talk about it, especially because she's from there. So, she probably felt that from being from that hometown. So I don't want to add more to that a little bit.
Yeah, so she's obviously a very high-profile player. I mean, she's coming off, as I said before, she's coming off winning Rookie of the Year last year. Before that, she helped lead UConn to another national championship, their 12th in program history. UConn is obviously one of the most storied collegiate programs in all of sports. And so she was riding high off of that. And so for someone as influential as her, as someone who generates a lot of attention, and for her to be able to speak up on this matter was definitely very, very crucial, to say the least, to have someone with her stature and her popularity, and to just so happen to be from Minnesota, be able to weigh in on what's going on. Really carries a lot of weight to it. And it also goes to show how many players in the WNBA really do live at those very treacherous intersections of society, because they exist along the margins of race and gender and class and sexuality and identity and so forth. And so for them, it's really natural for them to be able to speak up. And it really goes into sort of the broader history of women's sports. Women's sports, not just in America, but across the globe, have always had to play from behind, have always started off from behind, and having to work with what they've got and be able to work diligently to push for some semblance of equality. I mean, that's what we're seeing right now with the ongoing collective bargaining negotiations. So women athletes have always had to struggle and sacrifice and persevere to prove that they are, seen as worthy athletes. And to be on some parity with men in terms of media coverage, in terms of legitimacy, and all that sort of stuff. And so Paige Bueckers sits at that intersection. Yes, she's a high-profile player. She generates a lot of buzz and attention. She's got endorsements and all the accoutrements that come with athletic success. But she's still a citizen, and she's still a member of a league that has always had to play from behind and continue to struggle for legitimacy. And she's fully aware of that. And then she's also someone who has, who identifies as LGBTQ plus, is part of the queer community. So she sits at that intersection too. So it's a whole wide range of things that really come into one when you're talking about the WNBA.
Yeah, and also I want to talk real quick. You mentioned the media exposure. This news just came out a couple days before we just recorded about ESPN deciding to have this replacing pretty much Sunday night baseball coverage, since they're not going to have Sunday night baseball anymore. It's moving to NBC with the new contracts. They're going to have a dedicated women's Sunday night. Do you know a little bit about that? If you want to really speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's just really a testimony to where women's sports is now in the broader sporting culture and in the media landscape, because women's sports, as I said, has always had to play from behind. And one of those areas where they've really had to struggle for legitimacy was media coverage, because, historically, women's sports hasn't received enough media coverage and real mainstream coverage and deep analysis. There have been breakthroughs from time to time, and there have been, flashpoints, but it's always been this constant ebb and flow when it comes to women's sports and its place in the broader sporting media landscape. But in the last few years, when you've seen the rise in popularity in the WNBA, as well as in the National Women's Soccer League. And, we're talking about the we're just about to wrap up the Winter Olympics, and you have the U.S. women's hockey team winning the gold medal and capturing the hearts of so many people. You have professional women's volleyball, you have professional women's hockey. You have all these things. You have individual athletes that are ascending to great heights. You have Katie Ledecky in swimming. You have in the tennis world players like Coco Gauff and Naomi Osaka. So you have all of these things coming together in one moment, and it's only natural for ESPN to want to maximize that and to attach themselves to that by creating programming that's exclusively designed for women's sports and to help amplify women's sports in replacement of a former staple on ESPN like Sunday Night Baseball. So really, I see it as a case of meeting the moment and making it, and it's a great business move on their part because of the level of investment and the level of attention that's being given to women's sports.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about it in a little bit when we talk about the CBA negotiations, but I think this move will actually maybe help the players possibly leverage-wise, because look, hey, we're getting this dedicated night as women, and a big part of that is the WNBA, the league of the WNBA, along with probably like tennis. These are probably the top women's sports that people watch. And then now with the rise of this professional soccer league as well. But I feel like they might be able to use this as leverage. Like, hey, the big media giant ESPN thinks we deserve a night. They obviously are driven by profit ratings, right? And that's probably, and they actually gave up Sunday Night Baseball. They didn't really fight it. They kept some smaller package. Transitioning from that, like my whole life, I'm 40 years old. Like Sunday Night Baseball has been on ESPN my whole life that I remember watching baseball.
Same here.
Yeah, right. So like them making this change to me signals that, hey, these players might have this leverage. We're making this, ESPN thinks Disney pretty much thinks we're making the money. So why can't we get more of the pie pretty much in the CBA negotiations, which we'll talk about right now. But before we do, I want to talk about your latest article that you just wrote a couple days ago. This article is about Reverend Jesse Jackson's passing and focusing on his civil rights history as a progressive leader. But you even mentioned in there, obviously, really quick, some people might be a little critical of Jesse Jackson for not being radical enough. I'll just put that out there. But to me, I still see him as a positive, as someone who's more of a radical political person, because you mentioned in this article, he met with Fidel. He was for the Palestinian people of Palestinian liberation, right? These are things a lot of politicians haven't been able to do. So everyone has these flaws, but I still see him as a positive figure overall in the social civil rights movement. I'm glad you wrote this, and tied it into sports. So here you talk about in your article the WNBA players following Jackson's Rainbow Coalition's kind of tradition of like bridging these gaps between marginalized groups. Talked about a little bit. How do you think these players will navigate these? There's always these potential tensions of radical social justice, police brutality versus also LGBTQ rights, because a lot of women in the WNBA identify are LGBTQ. And also, how can they use this as a unified front while they're in, I guess, a pretty big fight with their labor rights?
Yeah, so what the Reverend Jesse Jackson was advocating for many, many years ago is exactly what the WNBA is fighting for. And it's very much sort of duplicating the Rainbow Coalition that he had really emphasized on when he made those two presidential runs in 1984 and 1988. And obviously, the originator of the Rainbow Coalition was obviously Fred Hampton, leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. So that's where the term Rainbow Coalition started. Jesse Jackson took up the mantle years later. And a lot of the issues that Jesse Jackson was fighting for in the 1980s are very much similar to what the players in the WNBA are fighting for. And what binds them together is that pursuit of intersectional justice. And if you think about it, when Jesse Jackson made those runs for president in 1984 and 1988, and you look at his platform, it was a progressive's dream. It was the progressive platform that, set the tone for the AOCs of the world, for Bernie Sanders, for Zoran Mandami, for so many others. And in that platform, it included things like the rights of Palestinians, which at that time was something that most people wouldn't touch. Now it's something that is front and center, but Jesse Jackson was advocating for that way back when it was unpopular. And then you fast forward to the present day, and you have a player like Natasha Cloud, who plays for the New York Liberty. Before that, she played for the Washington Mystics. And in 2020, she actually took the season off to devote her time to activism. She has been one of the league's most outspoken players on the issue of Palestinian rights. So in that sense, she's carrying on the legacy of Jesse Jackson in her own right in that way. And then you obviously, as I mentioned before, look at what the players did in 2016 and 2020. That was very much in keeping with the legacy of Jesse Jackson. And, you look at Jesse Jackson as this, hostage negotiator who went to places like Cuba, who went to Syria, who went to Yugoslavia, who went to Iraq, literally put his life on the line to ensure that Americans that were held in those nations hostage were released. And he used his oratorical skills and his diplomatic skills to be able to get those Americans out safely. And you fast forward to 2022 and you have Brittany Griner, who's held up in Russia on those drug possession charges, and she was held for almost close to 10 months. And there was this tension really to get her home, and frustrations and setbacks and negotiations that seemed endless. And the players took it upon themselves to really push then the Biden administration to do something about it and make it front and center. And that was as I made the case in the article, I felt as though that was very much in keeping with what Jesse Jackson was doing in the 1980s and in the 1990s, when he would go to hostile nations and negotiate with dictators and leaders of those nations to release American hostages and put his life on the line. And I even thought about it at the time when Brittany Griner was held up in Russia, that if Jesse Jackson was the Jesse Jackson of old, he would have been that person who would have traveled to Russia and negotiate for Brittany Griner's release and advocate on behalf of her. And there's just so many layers to it that really you can make a good argument for that the players in the WNBA have really carried on the legacy of Jesse Jackson as a collective on so many issues that were relevant then and are relevant now.
Yeah. So go check out his article. I'll put the links to these 2 articles that he just wrote. One of them was on January 30th about the WNBA players speaking up against ICE. And this latest article with Jesse Jackson that came out a couple days ago. So I'll put the links. Those are, tell the people where they can find it real quick.
SB Nation, Swish Appeal.
SB Nation. Yep, I used to follow a lot of SB Nation's Laker coverage as a Laker fan.
There you go.
It's been a while since I've been reading them lately. Usually just follow the Twitter updates. I haven't really read the articles lately, but good place. A lot of good blogs out there. So I'll put those links to that. Now let's get into kind of how we got connected for this podcast. Want to talk about the CBA negotiations that are currently happening. We got some recent news. I know the WNBA players just made a few concessions with their latest proposal back to the WNBA. Can you speak about what's going on right now?
Yeah, so I mean, the simple answer to that is what isn't going on. So it's just been a back and forth battle between the Players Association and the league about a new collective bargaining agreement. So the collective bargaining agreement that was in place beginning in 2019, 2020, expired in 2025, last fall, just around the time of the playoffs. And so the players really took it upon themselves, and they made it a point to let the previous CBA expire. And one of the things that they're really honing in on is the issue of revenue share, to get a decent amount of the revenue that's generated from the league. And the way the current infrastructure is, when you look at the NBA versus the WNBA, and also keep in mind that the NBA has subsidized the WNBA dating back to its original founding, which was 1996. And so the NBA, the players in the NBA, the way their infrastructure is set up is that they get 50% of the revenue generated. So the players get half of the revenue coming in just by design. And they've had to work for that. They've had, Players Association had to negotiate for that. I mean, and there's a long radical history of that as well. I encourage people to look up Oscar Robertson and players like that who made it possible. But in the WNBA, they only get 9 to 10% of the revenue that's generated, right? So what the players are asking for is, in their latest proposal that they put forward to the league, was a 30% cut of the revenue that's generated, which they're not asking for 50. And one of the they're not asking for 50, they're not asking for something that's well beyond their means. And one of the misconceptions that often gets put forward is that WNBA players are asking for NBA player salaries or NBA player money. Like they're asking for LeBron James money or Steph Curry money or, whatever big name players money, right? That's not what they're asking for, because they know they're not in a position to accumulate that. What they're asking for is just a fair share of the revenue that's generated. And some people will say, well, they don't have the money, they don't have the means to be able to give them that revenue share, or that they lose money by giving them all of this share of the revenue, or 30% of the revenue. But what the players are saying is that, the league is actually in a very good position right now, because we have sponsorships, we have investors, expansion fees are reaching all-time highs, franchise valuations are rising. Their television ratings are soaring. The league is in a really great position to take advantage of this opportunity. And so it's only right for the players to be able to get their fair share. And 30% isn't asking for too much when you look at the
Nope.
grand scheme of things. And, the league has already signed a deal with USA Network and others, an 11-year, last time I checked, it was 11-year, $2 billion, media rights deal over the course of 11 years. And, that says a lot. So it's an 11-year, $2 billion deal, media rights deal that the league agreed to. So that goes to show that there's money to be made in the WNBA, and it's only right for the players to be able to get that fair share. And these are with networks like USA Today, NBC, as we already talked about, ESPN. And then you got and then you also factor in merchandise sales for many of the top players. And then you get top players like Asia Wilson, who's coming off winning, another MVP award, and the Aces won another championship. I would argue I've been saying it forever that she's the best all-around player in the
Yeah,
game.
Clayton Clark gets all the attention, which deservingly so. But yeah, to me, she's the best. Look at if you count winning and how talented she is, right?
Yeah, best all-around. Yeah, best all-around player in the world,
Defender and offensive player.
Absolutely, at both ends of the floor, she's as good as they come. And then you got Caitlin Clark, who obviously, as I said, I covered her at Iowa. I've had the good fortune of interviewing her a few times, and she's deserves all the attention and notoriety and adulation that's coming her way, because she's also helping the league in a big way, and she deserves a lot of credit for bringing new audiences into women's basketball. I mean, and you're seeing the ratings increase across the board. In fact, Unrivaled just recently held a game in Philadelphia. They just recently had a game outside of Miami, and it was completely sold out. They're going to do Unrivaled is hosting another game pretty soon in Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken. They're playing a game in Brooklyn at the Barclays Center.
I can't remember who won the Philadelphia, because it's kind of like a tournament one-on-one. I forgot who won. I can't remember right now.
I can't remember
either. It's someone good. I just can't remember on top of my head.
Yeah. I've been preoccupied with so many things. It's unreal, but they sold out. Paige Bueckers was in that game, and she, was asked about it afterward, and she said, this is part and parcel. This is a testimony of just the growth and popularity for women's basketball and for the WNBA. So it's only right.
Chelsea Gray,
exactly. So it's only right for the players, to be able to get their fair share. And the fact that the league has been able to reach a point to where it's got a $2 billion media rights deal for a decade, there's money there.
And yeah, like you said, the misconception is they're not trying to ask for these NBA salaries, right? Where like a max contract, like for someone like LeBron is now he's older, he can't sign a long term, but it would be like $300 million. Mm-hmm. Or something like Anthony Edwards will be getting right now. It's just close to $300 million.
Right.
But
and then you also have, cities that are expanding. You see expansion teams pop up, Portland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Toronto. Yeah. I mean, you have these franchises that are setting up in the years ahead. Toronto's expected to make their debut this season. So it's really a testimony to really how women's basketball and the WNBA and just women's basketball period is really thriving right now. So it's time for the players to get their just due.
Yeah, and again, they're not asking for what the NBA got. The NBA's a new deal that kicked in this year's 11 years, $76 billion. Compare that to WNBA, which is 11 years, $2 billion. They're not way different, right? But they still deserve that $2 billion. It's still bigger from what it was before. We know they're making money, so why can't they get a bigger cut of the pie? Like you said, they're not even asking for 50%, which is the typical share that a lot of these professional sports leagues get, like MLBPAs, I think it's 51%. I think, right?
Yeah, and by the way, those deals that other professional leagues have already put in place, they didn't come without a fight.
Exactly.
If the NBA, as I mentioned before, if it wasn't for Oscar Robertson, players wouldn't be making the type of money that they're making right now. Free agency wouldn't be available. Same is true in Major League Baseball. If it wasn't for Curt Flood and Marvin Miller challenging the reserve clause in Major League Baseball, free agency wouldn't exist and players' salaries wouldn't be what they are today if it wasn't for that. So it hasn't come without struggle, and the WNBA is simply in keeping with that tradition. And also, that's a tradition that is very much part of women's sports. As I mentioned before, women's sports has always had to play from behind and always had to struggle for legitimacy. It took years for the U.S. women's soccer team to be able to get an equal pay deal that they got in 2022, where they were able to finally get equal pay along with the men's team. And then you also think all the way back to Billie Jean King in the 1970s, fighting for equal prize money for women in major tennis tournaments, and then starting the first ever women's professional tennis tour. So this is a struggle that has been ongoing for years, and this is not the new. It's just now it's time for the WNBA, and really the flashpoint of this was back in July, as I mentioned, back in July of last year. As I mentioned, I was in Indianapolis covering the All-Star game, and after the game, players, one of them was Brittany Sykes, was holding up a sign as Kathy Engelbert, who is currently the WNBA commissioner, as she was on the floor during the post-game ceremonies. Brittany Sykes came with a sign that said, "Pay the players," and that reverberated around the world, and that reverberated around the arena. Before the game, players came out onto the court wearing those shirts, those now iconic shirts that say, pay us what you owe us. And all the everybody wore a shirt. Everybody did, with the commissioner right there. And so this, again, is just nothing new. It's just in keeping with the historical tradition of athletes with limited means, limited resources, pushing back against, these corporate bigwigs and fighting for what is rightly theirs. And, kind of bringing it back to the legacy of Jesse Jackson for a moment. Jesse Jackson was somebody who, when he was fighting for his Rainbow Coalition during his presidential runs and then all the other activism that he did, he was somebody who made sure that everybody was looked after and was able to connect the dots and thread the needle for all of these different groups that had some stark differences, but shared a commonality in fighting for, legitimacy, fighting for, fair wages, fighting for, a good quality of life. And that's something that, African Americans and, on the south side of Chicago could relate to, white folks in Appalachia could relate to, Latinos in California could relate to. So he was able to bridge all those gaps and connect the dots and look out for everyone. And that, was the struggle for labor and dignity and all those different types of things. And you're seeing the WNBA players duplicate that right now with the CBA negotiations.
Yeah, and continuing on that conversation, recently it also came out because the NBA All-Star game was just this last weekend from our recording. It was last weekend in Los Angeles. But we had the WNBA president, former my favorite team, Los Angeles Sparks star player, now with, I think she's with Seattle, or did she leave again? Can't remember. But Nneka Ogwumike is the president of the WNBA, and she responded to Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner's public call for urgency after for a while, if people didn't know, WNBA kind of went silent for 6 weeks, didn't respond to the WNBA PA's proposal, and then out of nowhere they did. But pretty much Silver was kind of like it was kind of like a PR move. He was trying to put the blame back on the players here, even though we know the NBA pretty much it owns the WNBA, but technically the WNBA has their own commissioner, and Adam Silver is supposed to be separate, even though the NBA does run the WNBA, a lot of the similar owners. But can you talk about that PR attempt from the Adam Silver, and then her response to Silver, and how do you think is this like a test? Actually, that's our next. Sorry. You could give us her thoughts on that.
Yeah, I did think that, it was kind of tone deaf on Adam Silver's part. I mean, this is a guy who's often seen in some circles as the most progressive, sports commissioner out of all of them. And, compared to Roger Goodell, he certainly is. But, but I wouldn't go as far as to say he's purely progressive or, because he's in the business of making money too. So, his bottom line is about what's good for me, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. That's the mentality of a lot of commissioners of, major
They
sports
work for
leagues.
the owners. They're pretty much the
Right.
representative of the owners, right? So
Yeah, they answer to the
they're the
owners.
CEO of the
Exactly.
owners.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of I mean, if I wish that Adam Silver would at least put a timetable on it, because at least that would indicate to me that he cares at least. But he was just like, you know what, just get back to me when you're done. Just get something done. I don't care when. Hopefully it's soon, but just get it done. I don't want to keep answering for this. At least if he were to give some timetable, like a set date, an expiration date to come up with a deal, that at least shows some sort of investment and care. And so it was only fitting for someone like Nneka and Gwumike to be able to speak up and to call it out for what it is. And again, it's just in keeping with what many of the players in the WNBA have been up against for years, and they know how to play the game. And and it's funny, we're talking about Nneka and Gwumike. It's been said in some circles, at least in the circles that I've navigated through or navigated in, that they see her as someone who could be the next WNBA commissioner in the years
In the
ahead.
future. Okay.
In the future, yeah. I mean, her name has been floated around constantly. I mean, like you said, she's been in charge of the Players Association for quite a number of years now. She played an extremely vital role in the 2019-2020 CBA agreement that raised player salaries, increased access to all different kinds of benefits, including maternity leave for players and so forth. And so she was very instrumental in that. She's also known for her advocacy work. I did an interview with her back in the summer of 2024 before the election about her taking over LeBron James's organization that he started called More Than a Vote, which he started in 2020 to promote voting rights, to promote civic engagement, voter education. And so she took up that mantle in 2024, and she transitioned it or tailored it toward reproductive rights in particular, because this was obviously 2 years after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and reproductive rights was at the forefront of our political discourse. And so she met the moment right then and there. But it was fitting for her to be able to speak up about that and to call to attention on it. And yeah, I thought Adam Silver was very tone deaf. I just thought that he just saw it as an annoyance when, he's said himself at various points in times, you can make the argument when it was convenient to say it about the growth and popularity of the WNBA. But if you want to see that growth continue on, then now's the time to be able to lend your voice and use your bully pulpit and to say, look, this league is thriving. It has potential. It has shown its potential. People are watching. People are paying attention. They're buying jerseys. They're going to games. Again, $2 billion, 11 years with all these major media companies. There's money to be made. Get something done and get it done by then. And to me, that shows a level of investment, and he didn't do that.
Yeah, and this is all at the All-Star weekend when there was even more controversy in terms of like Israel, LeBron's comments a couple of weeks ago with the whole Durant and Curry stuff investments. And then we have the whole Clippers situation, Steve Ballmer, right? I'm like, NBA, you got your own dirty laundry to deal with. But then here you are kind of dismissing, but also kind of critiquing, putting the blame on the players here. I also want to talk about keeping on this whole issue of the CBA and then kind of tying it to your articles from their WNBA Players Activism through playing right now in the Unrivaled League with Breanna Stewart and then Paige Bueckers all speaking up, which has happened, which you wrote in your article, and then also keeping up with that tradition of Jesse Jackson. Players are they've mentioned this, which I think is great, and I think one of these player labor unions need to do this. I kind of, as much as I'm a baseball fan and way it's looking, they might go on a, might not have baseball after this season either. But I hope the players go on strike. They don't give in. The WNBA players were also mentioning the word strike, that magic word strike. So I think this is a great development as someone for pro labor rights. Like, as much as I'm a fan, I don't want it to get as much as they can from this pie, right? And if they got to use a strike, that's one of their tools they could use, right? To get what they want. So do you think, just keeping with what you mentioned in your articles, that whole theme, their activism, do you see this battle as like an ultimate test of the players' like social justice platform, and then applying their advocacy? Now it's going to be applied to their, getting more equity in their own workplace.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest fight of their lives, frankly. I mean, because this is dealing with their livelihood. This is dealing with, what they do. This is dealing with who they are. And, obviously, players threatening to go on strike is always a last resort, but it's something that, they use, justifiably so, as a means of leverage, as a way to get the leagues to acquiesce and to meet them where they're at, and sort of reminding them that, hey, you make money off of our backs, and without us there, without us playing, you lose money. You want to talk about losing money? You'll lose money when we're not playing. So, that's the leverage. That's the leverage that they have, that's within their power, within their capacity. And athletes have been able to use that at various times effectively to their own betterment. I mean, obviously, in the short term, and in the short term, it can definitely hurt the league, from a PR standpoint, from a reputational standpoint. You mentioned Major League Baseball. Obviously, the baseball strike of 1994 was a consequential moment in sports history, because it was the first time that the World Series hadn't been played since the early 1900s. There was a work stoppage. Players and owners weren't on the same page. And really, the context surrounding that at that time was, it was millionaires and billionaires that were fighting over more money. And then the average fan who just, works for a living and tries to save enough money to go to a game, are being left out of the equation. I would say that dynamic isn't necessarily the same as what's happening right now with the WNBA, because you got the Asia Wilsons, you got the Paige Bueckers, you got the Caitlin Clarks, who got the Angel Reeses and the Sabrina Ionescos, and all these great players who do make a lot of money. But the majority of the money that they make is from endorsement deals.
Exactly.
And then you also have players, even some big name players, who go overseas to supplement their income, which is why Brittany Griner was in Russia to begin with, was because the money that she got paid by Russian oligarchs, no less, was 3 times as much, if 3-4 times as much as her salary in the WNBA. And she was one of the top players. And Candace Parker, another great player who just recently was nominated to the Hall of Fame. She played overseas for a good number of years because the money that they were paying her.
And she's she kind of started the trend too of WNBA players that currently play, but then like on the side they appear like on ESPN and stuff as broadcasters, exactly. Right? Like Shanae Ogumake pretty much followed in those same footsteps
on ESPN. Yeah, exactly. Shanae Ogumake.
They got to do a side gig in the media to make more money.
Make more money, exactly. Which
they probably get paid more from that media gig than from their actual. If you think about it, more likely, right?
Yeah. I mean,
on the
and at least for them, they could rest their bodies and not have to endure the wear and tear of playing basketball, because
playing overseas, having to go to other country and stuff.
Exactly. So if you think about it, the WNBA season begins in May. They play until October. That's when the playoffs and the finals take place. Then they take a short break, a very, very short break. Then many of them immediately fly to Turkey or Italy or, parts of Europe, China, Mexico, wherever, just to play professional basketball and make a pretty good living playing overseas, and they live overseas. They live overseas during that period of time. Then that season, continues on
They're
from
pretty
the
much
winter
playing year
until.
round. They don't even get a break in the off season.
Exactly, exactly. And then training camp for the WNBA usually begins in April. Then the season begins in May. They barely get a break. I mean, let's just put Caitlin Clark to the equation. So Caitlin Clark comes off her record-setting season at Iowa, her senior year, becomes the all-time leading scorer. She's the number one pick in the WNBA draft in April of 2024, drafted by the Indiana Fever. And the draft was merely a week or two after Iowa played in the national championship game against South Carolina. And then she gets drafted. Then she has like a week or two to get herself back into shape and get into training camp. And then shortly thereafter, the season begins in May. Then they play until October. Then the season ends. And for many of those players, they go overseas, or, for some of them, they go to Unrivaled or Athletes Unlimited or these other alternative professional leagues where they play to make additional money. But yeah, like you said, they play year round. And so they don't have the luxury in the way that Major League Baseball players do. Yeah, I mean they're fighting for their piece of the pie, but also they have a pretty sizable amount of pie to begin with because these guys are making a pretty decent living, right? And obviously, labor rights and all that stuff filters in regardless, and arguments to be made for that. But you compare Major League Baseball players to WNBA players, like they're up here, and the players in the WNBA are right down here, and they're it's just not the same.
Yeah, and I know some players make as much money as I make for my job. I have like a civil service job. I make under 100, but like maybe like around 80. I'll say it. There's players that make that, and they're professional. Like, not that they deserve more than me or something, right? Like, but when we're talking
Right.
about other professional athletes, and especially how big the WNBA's player, like you would think they would be making better money than like someone like me in my regular job that we've seen from other leagues, right? Like we know they should
Right.
be getting that piece of the pie, especially how much they're making billions of dollars off there, right? And that's I'm glad you brought up also Rivaled and Athletes Unlimited. That's another reason why these leagues were started, because they need that extra money that the WNBA is not providing them.
Right.
And they're making more money in some of these leagues. Certain players, it's kind of like, Chelsea Gray just made like almost like her whole salary or something from winning this recent tournament with Unrivaled.
Mm-hmm.
So that just tells you that right there. So I'm glad they're putting that strike option on the table, because I don't know. What do you think's going to happen? Do you think, can't predict the future, but
Can't predict the future. I mean, I've
it's
said it
coming
before.
closer. The season's coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's late February.
The
I
draft.
mean, yeah, the draft, they already suspended free agency until they get a new CBA agreement. So there's that. I mean, I'm encouraged by the words of Nafisa Collier, who is one of the players that has been leading the charge in the CBA negotiations. MVP, great player, championship winner, who really took Kathy Engelberg to task this past fall in a big way, calling out her leadership. And also, I'm encouraged by her words when she said that she believes that the season will start, that there will be a season. It's just a matter of time. And then Brianna Stewart came forward and said that, they've been making inroads. And this was obviously before the WNBA, the league, sort of pushed back or rejected the proposal that the players had made recently about the 30% revenue share increase. But I do think that there is some traction that's happening just based on what I've seen, and that I've said it before that I believe that something will get done, because usually these things get done right at the last minute, right? If you think about it, usually a deal comes to fruition at the last minute. And so I believe that'll be the case. If not, it'll be an extraordinary moment in sports history and a landmark moment in women's sports for sure. But we'll see what happens. And the other thing I wanted to mention, because I talked about the expansion that, you have new teams coming down the
Mm-hmm.
pike.
Mm-hmm.
There is a bit of a dilemma that exists within the WNBA because, expansion of new teams is great and is great for the league as a whole in terms of growth and visibility. But then also there is a dilemma here and there's a contradiction here because, you create these new teams but you pay them exactly the same.
Yep.
Or you have limited roster spaces. So players in the WNBA, or WNBA teams, they only have a scarce number of players on their roster. It's like 12 players. And so they draft players in the league, they try them out, they go through training camp, and then inevitably some
Yeah,
players
there's a
get
lot of
waived.
talent out there that just doesn't have a spot just because there's not enough space. Not that they're not good enough.
Yeah, there's not enough space, or in some cases they may not be good enough. But then you also have those players who are pretty good, and they don't have they get waived or they don't make the team, and then they're left with nothing. And now it's a feeling of what do I do now? And then you also have issues around travel and amenities
Yep.
and things of that nature. One of the big issues that came to light in 2024 was the issue of charter flights. So you had top teams like the Aces and the Liberty and others who could fly charter, but then you have some of the lower tier teams that travel coach. So when they're getting on a flight that you and I are
Yep.
getting on. So they're pretty much on the same flight with everyone else. And obviously commercial flights, we know how comfortable those are.
I don't know if people
But
have ever been on a flight. Like I've been on, waiting for my flight, and there's like a college team or something that's going to be on my flight. Just imagine that, but it's actually the professional WNBA
yep,
players that are like the superstars. Like,
yeah. So now
right? It's
yeah,
crazy.
exactly.
It's like they're
Exactly. So
traveling the same way they did when they were in college.
there you go. And these are
Some
professional
of those
athletes.
college
Exactly.
teams have better. Some of them had charter, like some of these top teams in the WNBA didn't.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, yeah, exactly. And there's been progress made on that
Mm-hmm.
where more teams now have, charter flights, the Indiana Fever being one of them. I mean, obviously, when you have Caitlin Clark on the team, you got to step up your game
Yep.
in so many levels. And then you have state of the art practice facilities that many top teams have, like, Vegas and New York and Seattle and Phoenix. And that comes from ownership that actually invests back into the team. Coming from Chicago, covering the Sky, as I've done since 2021, that just hasn't been the case. It's been an absentee ownership. It's been a lackadaisical ownership, and then you have Michael Alter, who
Oh yeah, there was
is
that
being
controversy, right? Yep.
yeah, he's the majority owner of the Sky, and he was recently sued for self dealing for a breach of fiduciary duty. He's been called, like it really is a suit alleging that he's been mismanaging the team, which is a complete understatement. This is a team that hasn't invested back into this is an ownership, excuse me, that hasn't invested back into the team, that is still behind it when it comes to upgrading a practice facility. Let me tell you something, Miguel. I've covered some Chicago Sky practices. They practice at a place called the Sachs Recreation Center in Deerfield. It is basically an equivalent to the YMCA.
Oh my
You walk
god,
in,
a professional
you walk
WNBA team
exactly,
in
and they have a
Chicago,
court in
right?
Chicago. They have a court at the far end of the building. They have a court dedicated to them where they have one of their championship banners from 2021 hanging up. They have a court that's decorated for them, but it's I don't even know how to describe it. It is exactly like a YMCA facility because on the one hand you got like youth leagues that are playing or little league teams playing, and you have aerobics classes next door and people using the weights and whatnot, and then at the far end of the building you have a professional basketball team practicing, like, and the new state of the art facility was supposed to open, or last time I checked was uh, scheduled to open this year, and hopefully that's the case. But then few months ago there were setbacks in terms of um, budgeting and deadlines and things of that nature. So, I mean, this team has been grossly mismanaged. It's been grossly underfunded. It's been grossly underappreciated from the ownership itself. Every other team, pretty much in the WNBA, has evolved with the times and has had ownership that has invested back into the team. The best example that I can think of is the Phoenix Mercury, that has great ownership investment and state of the art practice facilities and all these amenities that the players get, and the Chicago Sky is still stuck in time. And so it's it's not one issue over another, it's all interconnected.
Yeah, and Chicago Sky, not that long ago they won the title when Candace Parker left my Sparks to their team, and they had superstar players, right? And then they drafted Angel Reese, and how popular she is, especially when they, especially how they've tried to, the whole thing of pitting her against Caitlin Clark, which I think is kind of dumb.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Right?
I'm glad you mentioned that.
But they have that. They have that reach of some player, like.
Yeah, I mean, it dates. I mean, the thing with her and the thing with Angel and Caitlin dates back to the 2023 national championship game between LSU and Iowa, which was which drew 10 million viewers. It was a landmark moment in women's basketball history. I wasn't there to cover the game, but I did cover it from Carver Hawkeye Arena because they had a watch party for it.
Okay, you're at the watch party.
I was at the watch party, but and then as LSU was on the verge of winning the game, Angel Reese does the no look gesture or you can't see me gesture, and people saw that as a slight towards Caitlin Clark. And then one thing led to another, and then that unleashed all these, very racialized Twitter discussions takes about. Yeah, exactly. And I've said before, I've had the privilege of covering both Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. I've had the privilege of talking to both of them. I don't know them well, but in my presence, talking with them, they're both very pleasant, very nice, very cordial. And I remember writing an op-ed last year at the beginning of last year's season when the Fever and Sky opened the season in Indianapolis, and then Angel drew that hard foul on Caitlin, and it was called a flagrant foul, which it was, but people took that and ran with it and said, "Oh, she's assaulting Caitlin or she's attacking Caitlin." And generally, these are people that don't know what they're talking about because they don't watch. I doubt they watch a lot of basketball or know much about basketball, let alone women's basketball, and so they don't really care about it. They just using it as some grievance politics type of thing. And I wrote in my op-ed that about calling out the loud voices of non-basketball people that are weighing in on this. And I said that the people who think that a pick and roll is an appetizer are the ones who are weighing in on Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese when they have no idea what they're talking about. And then I also said that Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, they're presented this false choice. They either have to be the best of friends or they have to be the worst of enemies. And the truth of the matter is that, they're neither. They're not, from my understanding, they're not best friends and they're not worst enemies. They're just competitors.
Yeah, just compete against each other.
They just compete against each other, and and they've been teammates before, and they're also teammates now because this year Team USA will be competing in the World Cup in Puerto Rico. And last December, they had a weekend practice sessions for Team USA at Duke University, and they invited the top players to come in and practice to get a spot on Team USA. Caitlin was there, Angel was there, Paige Bueckers was there. Juju Watkins of USC was there. I mean, she didn't get a chance to practice because she's coming off an ACL injury, but nevertheless, you have the future coming in and playing, and it was fine. It was fine with Caitlin and Angel. Like, they were on the same court. If they didn't want to play with each other, they could have said it. But they're on the same court with each other. They were feeding the ball to each other. It's again, like, they're competitors, they're teammates. They don't have to be the best of friends. They can just respect each other and go from there. And so, and I said, I wrote a story about that, earlier this year, that this is the future of Team USA. The Olympics will be coming in 2028 in Los Angeles. the United States women's basketball team is one of the greatest dynasties in all of sports. They've won every single gold medal at the Olympics since 1996 in Atlanta. And this is what we're going to expect in 2028 in Los Angeles. You're going to have Caitlin and Angel and Paige and Juju, possibly Juju, on the on that team representing America on the world stage. So there's a lot going on.
Oh yeah. So we'll keep up. We'll see how it goes with those CBA negotiations coming up. Because it's coming up, the season and the draft. So something's gonna have to give in terms of where it's gonna go. Before we go, I know you want to talk about something, but before that, I want you just real quick. Kind of heard about this very recently and kind of annoyed at myself for not knowing about it because I guess it came out a couple months ago. But there's like this thing called Project B, like a new league or something. Could you talk about that really quick? And then we could talk about, before we go, what you wanted to talk about before we go on the podcast.
Yeah, so like Project B is just another new professional basketball league that's being started. It's a women's and men's league.
Okay.
That's being started, and it's just, from my understanding, it's more of another alternative professional basketball league that women's players can be a part of, can take advantage of, to make some additional money, grow the sport. And you have players like Nneka and Alyssa Thomas and Jewel Lloyd and Jonquel Jones and so many others that are, that have agreed to play, or at least by my account, at least 10 players have agreed to play. So they're starting in Japan next year. So it's just another alternative professional basketball league that, women's basketball players are setting up as a way to make additional money. And, it fits in perfectly with what's happening right now.
Exactly. So I'll put some info on that also in the show notes, because I just recently heard about it. I'm like, oh, and I was like researching for this episode. So before you go, you did want to talk about something that you do before you go on the podcast. Just talk about it real quick.
Yeah, so the one thing that I do outside of my journalism work, or something that I'm starting right now, is that I also teach at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. And I am in the process of developing my long-term academic venture, which is a sport and society initiative. And what that is, it'll be a mechanism or a campus, it's a campus initiative, and sort of bridging partnerships with the broader community about how to use sport as an effective tool for social change, getting athletes involved with community organizations, and eventually setting up a speaker series where we can invite, journalists and athletes and coaches and scholars and so many others that work in this field to come and take part in different things, lectures and panel discussions and so forth. And just really excited about it. It's something that I've been wanting to do for some time now. So the Augustana College Sport and Society Initiative that I'm co-founding right now with some colleagues of mine. And so in addition to my journalism work, that's what I do.
It's pretty dope. I know my very first guest, when I started this podcast, I did solo episodes, and then I started doing the guest format interviews. My first big guest was he's a journalist, author. He also worked at for the Tampa Bay Rays in like media, Andrew Marinis. But he works at you know him, right?
A friend of mine.
Yeah, I know. He has the thing in Vanderbilt, right? Vanderbilt University has like that kind of similar thing, right? I know when I went to San Jose State for grad school, and they have something similar over there too. Obviously, with the tradition of Dr. Edwards, Tommy Smith, John Carlos. So it's something very similar like that. So that's great to see that's going to be there, somewhere else at another college.
Shout out to Andrew. He's a special person, a great mentor, someone that I've consulted with for the Sport and Society Initiative as I was drafting my proposal. He provided some advice and some edits and things of that nature. And he's just a wonderful guy. And he also wrote the book Inaugural Ballers, which is about the 1976 U.S. Women's basketball team that competed in the first ever
Olympics,
Olympics for women's basketball.
Yeah, shout out to Andrew. I think he still listens on my pod. Like, he was my first guest. He really helped me out. Yeah, he really helped me out. So like he like introduced me to other people to come on my podcast. He was like my first guest. Oh, and he gave me his book about Glenn Burke. About his story. But he did give me that book as well, and I was supposed to have him on my pod about it, and then I took like a 1.5 year like hiatus from making episodes. Me and my fiance had our son. So I like didn't get to it, so I feel bad. Like Andrew, I never told him like, "Hey, I forgot to get you on the pod to talk about it."
Hey, listen, it's never too late because this summer will mark the
50 years, right?
50-year anniversary.
Hey, good idea, Zachary. Probably have to hit up Andrew. Yep, good. Thank you for pointing that out, because now I have an idea in my head. So hopefully I'll talk to Andrew again, because he was literally my first like guest that like gave me his book. Like, I got to read it and have him on. It's because of him I started having guests. So shout out to Andrew Marinus. It's glad that you're doing something like that, man. Need that. That's kind of the whole point of my podcast. This started as a blog when I was in grad school, and didn't become a podcast until the whole bubble thing happened in 2020.
Perfect timing.
Yep. So that's when I turned it and decided to make this into a podcast. But yeah.
And by the way, just really quickly, shout out to Andrew, but also shout out to Andrew's father, David Moranis, who was a pioneering author, journalist at the Washington Post, who wrote a book about Roberto Clemente, who wrote books about people like Roberto Clemente.
Yeah, that's a great book, by the way, as well. So yeah, shout out to the Marinus. And yeah, that's all. Thank you for coming to the podcast, Zachary. Before we go, anything more you want to say? Is there anything new you're working on that might come out?
Well, I'm in the process of developing a podcast, or co-developing a podcast right now called She's Always Had Game, which is about some of the greatest moments in women's basketball history. It'll be on the 9450 network that was started by my friend Daniel Artest, and we are...
that's the Meta Artest brother, huh?
Yes, it is. And so we're starting that up. Me and my co-host, co-developer, Kevin Lewis, shout out to Kevin. We are putting that together right now as we speak, and we are looking to start our first episode on March 3rd. So I will work with you, Miguel, to provide you all the details for that. And that's a podcast that we want to celebrate some of the greatest moments in women's basketball history, as well as some of the greatest players.
That's dope. I'm a Laker fan, so Meadow, Ron Artest, love that, those last Laker team years with Kobe when he won the title. Shout out to Daniel Artest, because I started following him on Twitter. I don't think he has Twitter anymore, but a long time ago I was one of his followers, so if he ever hears this. But shout out to the Artest family, a big basketball fan. Meta does a lot of good work too, so look out for Zach's podcast. If he gives me any info on that, whenever we post this episode, which will probably be in a couple weeks, because I have my next one coming out next week. Nice. I could post info on that if you have anything when we put in the show notes. But thank you, Zachary, for covering this. It was awesome talking to you here, even to see here that, you've talked to some dope players in the WNBA like Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese. Like, the work you've done sounds... keep up the good work. And then if you have anything else new coming out before this episode comes out, we'll be in touch. I could put that in the links as well. But thank you. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Miguel.